evangelicals and religious life. This is an interesting subject, a short subject, so today's video is not going to be very long on this, but I think that this is an important overlap for the specific reason of understanding the general perspective of evangelicals, we'll call them, on the history of religious life. And the reason why I think this is an interesting perspective is because it was one that I had for many years, growing up in a tradition that, at very least, had a suspicion of monastic orders, if not outright animosity towards them. The interesting thing that the author brings up in this particular chapter, I think, chiefly, is the concept of space and the concept of, quote-unquote, the real world. The reason I found this very interesting is because it touches on something that I think I inherited from many others within my particular tradition, but turns out to not only not be correct, but actually turns out to be antithetical to the way that the vowed monastic religious actually understand their own lives and understand what they're doing whenever they are vowing a certain vow to be a part of a specific community and a specific space for basically for time immemorial. When we talk about evangelical, we'll get into this in just a moment, it's helpful for us to be very clear what we mean by that term. Whenever the normative or nominative person within both the English side, the British side, or the United States, the average person, when I say evangelical, is probably going to have a specific brand of Christianity in their head. The particular sort of evangelical Christian has taken on, even within Pew Research reports, has taken on a particular sort of quasi-political entity as well. And to be an evangelical Christian, there are certain kind of built-in social assumptions about those particular Christians. And the built-in social assumptions of quote-unquote evangelical Christians is both helpful and also very unhelpful. Because just as we know within our particular denominations, as we know within the Episcopal Church and in the Anglican communion in general, no Anglican is like another Anglican. I am a particular sort of person that is going to be different than probably what you think about Christianity. In fact, even if we're both Anglican, we might have some differences of opinion on various things that we know kind of insider baseball in the particular traditions we come from. But at the same time, we would be mistaken to point the finger at each other and call ourselves unchristian for holding certain, let's say, secondary beliefs rather than the primary beliefs of the creedal beliefs about Jesus and the church and the Trinity and so on and so forth. But when we talk about evangelical, it's also helpful for us to be able to understand the terminology we're dealing with here, particularly from the perspective of the author, self-described evangelical Anglican. One of the things that we need to kind of pick up on is that the way that he's using evangelical is being able to describe a certain, let's say, Protestant Reformation aspect of his own theology. And in a lot of ways, that yields itself into lower emphasis on ceremony, a lower emphasis on the particular kind of ceremony, and likewise will also lean into the deep, deep importance of teaching for the evangelical tradition, and likewise of deep attention to prayer within the movement of the Spirit. So it's the thing where deep study, deep teaching is a really important part of the Protestant Reformation. In fact, it's probably one of the chief things that we get from the Protestant Reformation is solid biblical teaching, paying really careful attention to what the Bible actually says about something, right? On the other hand, because of the less formal, less focus on ceremony, one of the things that, obviously within the Protestant Reformation, we have is a suspicion of anything that looks quote-unquote Romish, or things that look Roman Catholic. Well, to be completely honest, one of the chief expressions of things that look quote-unquote Roman Catholic is the monastic orders. These monastic orders have been established long, long before we had the Protestant Reformation, and really, honestly, long before we could ever speak of Roman Catholics. Really, if you kind of think about it, the monastic movement in Christianity was one of the earliest movements in Christianity. It started in the 200s and really, in a lot of ways, characterized the early church's foundational theology for really the rest of its existence all the way up to now. As much as we might want to think in the evangelical sense that these monastics are these kind of weird people who separate themselves from the real world, a deeper dive actually reveals deep sympathies between the evangelical world and the vowed religious world. And to take a look at that just in brief, because this chapter was not very long, we need to get into what exactly do we mean when we talk about the real world, and why is it actually very, very dangerous for us to talk about the life of monastics as not living in the real world. Let's talk about what we mean by the real world. So, if we were to pictorially put this into, let's say, we'll call this the real world right here. So, real world. When we think about what we put inside this circle, what are you tempted to say is living in the real world? Well, for, let's say, recovering, those recovering from bad conceptions of what monastic orders mean, we could, on the one hand, I'm going to use my red marker to talk about the Protestant perspective. We could be tempted to put real world as, in other words, the everyday world. And we would be tempted to separate that from monastic escapism. Again, note that this is just the general Protestant perspective on this. Generally, we're going to see a bifurcation between those who live in the everyday world and this monastic expression of, well, what exactly do monastics do all day, right? There is also something that is kind of undergirding this a little bit, which is something that probably we've heard before, which is this idea of the Protestant work ethic. In which it is highly regarded within the history of evangelical Protestantism, especially within the United States, that to work with one's hands and to be constantly at work is a part of how you work out your salvation. And what I mean by that, I'm not meaning this idea of quote-unquote works-based righteousness, which is something that we obviously are avoiding here. However, there is something to be said when John Calvin himself said that in his theology of predestination, God predestines those for salvation, but there have to be some sort of evidences of your particular salvation, or you also could manifest evidences of your damnation. And other Protestant and later Calvinists are going to elucidate this even more precisely, which is to say that, and again, I'm not quoting all that would hold this view, but there are a significant number of theologians after John Calvin who would hone in on this idea that, in fact, it is important for me to look to see if I can find manifestations of my holiness or otherwise. And part of what builds into that is, am I willing to work for what I need every day? Obviously, this right here is going to have some deep suspicion about, again, quote, monastics that sit around all day. Obviously, we know that that's not true, but let's hold that perspective, because it's a perspective that a lot of people have. Because this particular work ethic right here is going to criticize the monastic orders and say, well, why are you sitting around all day, or why are you sitting inside the walls all day? And this particular failure of perspective is one in which is mostly, I would say mostly due to this, which is anti-Catholic sentiment. Anti-Catholic sentiment is very, very alive and well in the part of the country that I live in. Anything that looks Catholic, and by the way, they don't ever put the words Roman in front of that, anything that looks Catholic is something that is akin to being near Satanism for some people. And again, anti-Catholic sentiment obviously is also going to feed into this deep suspicion of monasticism. But when you actually gain a perspective that begins to break down this miscommunication, I'm going to use the term Catholic perspective. For the Catholic perspective, there is no such thing as real world versus unreal. So, there's no such thing as living in an imaginary world. And in that way, the Catholic perspective on this is that monastic escapism, on this perspective, rather in the Catholic perspective, is instead an example of particular call. Notice how we're transgressing the boundary here because there's no such thing as real world versus unreal, okay? Instead, monasticism for the Catholic perspective is going to be a manifestation of Jesus' particular call on someone. And that particular call is, here we go, is evangelical. What do Catholics mean by evangelical? Well, let's think about this. Before we use the term evangelical to describe a group of Christians, the term evangelion is simply the word that means gospel. And in that way, gospel, good news, is that word that is often used to describe missionary activity. We are being evangelical, we are being good news oriented in spreading that good news. And the reason why Catholics are going to say this is, by the way, the British Isles were first evangelized by Benedictine monastics. So the first people to evangelize the British Isles were Benedictines. They were monastics. And the reason why this is important is because this particular monastic escapism over here is also expressed by particular space. And this concept of evangelical and particular space is where our author is locating the common language between the vowed monastic orders and the evangelical side of the church. Because any church planter that you talk to is going to, in a lot of ways, come back to this idea of the particular space in which we are doing this church plant is deeply important to consider. The place in which we do our evangelical work has to be deeply considered because we have particular cultures and subcultures, we have particular places and languages, we have particular ways in which we are actually, ways in which we live already, and the ways in which we have to adjust how we live when we go to a different place. The thing is that in the Catholic perspective on religious orders, the monastery is not an escape from the world. The monastery is the particular place at which the work of God and the evangelical mission to the world actually meet in its particular space. Because if we actually look at St. Benedict's rule, St. Benedict is actually very clear about the fact that these Christian monastics living together are, in fact, service lived to the community. One of the places which you see that most specifically is the person who is in charge of hospitality for the Benedictine monastery. And those monastics in charge of hospitality are primarily taking care of the stranger, taking care of the people who come to the monastery, giving them food and shelter overnight. And in the much more expansive version that we have right now, we have those who actually are dealing with medical issues and running hospitals. Is it any wonder that when you look around at various places, you might find a St. Vincent's Hospital, which is, in fact, one of the heritages we have from the Roman Catholic side about the monastics who run hospitals. Because that was part of how the monastics live in their ways of particular call, evangelical in scope, and in a particular space in which we're not separating ourselves from the world, but rather this is the meeting place in which God's action in the world touches down, if that makes sense. So, again, notice how there might be some misunderstandings between these two perspectives, right? Because let's just at least be honest with ourselves. Yes, monastic communities can be insular, but at the very important point that monastic communities are not built to be insular, and that monastic observances of the office hours and having a specific place to live, work, and have their being under a vow before God is not living in an unreal world. Rather, in a way, you could say that it is sanctifying the world in that way. Here's an example of how we should operate as a community or as a society. Notice, however, by the way, that exact description I just gave you is what the Protestant perspective would call everyday world. Because everyday world is about how the church, and when I say church, I mean local community, how the church and the local community is being the place where the touch between God's work in the world and the rest of the community meet. And notice how, in the Roman Catholic perspective, the monastery, local community, Isn't that interesting? How these two, right here, actually overlap almost exactly. Recognizing the common threads between particular perspectives, either fair or unfair, it's helpful for us to recognize that when we are looking at how different sides are viewing what we count as the real world or real ministry, we might actually discover that we actually have a failure of imagination. And the reason why that's important for us to at least highlight in this chapter is because when we bifurcate the idea of monastic life from a perfectly acceptable evangelical expression of that monastic life, we begin to lose the core convictions of the early monastics themselves. Because when the early monastics went and did what they did, like St. Anthony of Egypt, they were not going away to join communities. They were, in a way, they were going to pursue God in a way that was very individual, very particular in call, you could say, okay? So particular in call. And because of their particular call at a particular time, God began to work amongst the monastics to bring about this kind of, let's say, developed expression of monasticism, which we find some of the early development in Augustine's rule or in St. Benedict's rule. As we continue along, we have more community-wide sorts of interactions between the monastics and the community, even so far that in the early 500s and 600s, there is a delegation of monastics led by another Augustine, Augustine of Canterbury, sent to the British Isles to evangelize the British Isles using the model of planting a monastery. In the same way that we would talk about church planters going and planting a church community. So when we think about these maybe sort of odd partners in the church, and I think that the author highlighted the importance of the fact that maybe because we're so much better exposed in our more kind of globalized way that we see the world now, because we're so much more exposed to the differences between the Roman Catholic and Protestant side, not even to talk about the interreligious side here, but just that we're much better exposed, and we have much less anxiety about interacting with someone from a different expression of the faith. And that is actually, I think, quite a good thing, rather than something that waters down, quote unquote, the Christian tradition. Recognizing the particular calls on particular people's lives in the particular perspectives we come from is helpful, not simply because it's helpful for us to kind of get straight what we might not understand in our perspectives, but it helps us be able to understand where the deep common lines are. We just might express it in kind of different functional ways. Hopefully, this is a helpful model for us to think about. Because, as we've talked about the past 10 weeks now, vows within the Christian church are always constitutive of a person who has a particular call of Jesus on their lives, who is saying before the gathered community of believers that here is how I'm understanding my call, and the rest of the gathered believers are saying, we accept you into this particular expression of that call, okay? Whether that be the setting aside of our old non-baptized life for the baptized life of the church, or whether that be setting aside our old life and taking up the new discipline of monastic virtue. But then, of course, think about the rest of the ways we've talked about vows so far, right? Marriage, and likewise ordination, and confirmation, so on and so forth. There are ways in which the commonality of the underlying baptized life of the church is also still an expression that you can recognize across denominations that you would never imagine would have commonality between them. It's strange to say, but it is very true that Baptists and Roman Catholics share so much more in common than Baptists and Muslims, or Roman Catholics and Hindus. We actually share so much more in common that we often can only focus on the places where we have disagreement. But in places like monasticism and evangelicalism, the helpful thing to recognize is that I don't think, and I think the author is very convincing in this way, I don't think that it's actually accurate to say that there is that huge difference between religious life and evangelical life. In fact, Roman Catholics would actually insist that the evangelical life is identified with the monastic life for those who are called to that life. And that maybe taking on that perspective can help us ground a bit more the fact that Jesus calls us in various and different ways to express the call on our lives that Christ needs us to undertake for the purposes of the good of the church and the good of the gospel. And that it just so happens that the nuts and bolts of how that works itself out simply look different depending on which cultural expression of Christianity that we're part of. Because we need to be honest. Baptist expression of Christianity is a cultural expression of Christianity just as much as it's a theological expression. And anybody who's done overseas missions will tell you that. We need to recognize how culturally conditioned we are in the ways in which we express our own ways of doing Christianity. And that also includes the fact that Anglican Christians from Africa look and sound different from Anglican Christians in North America. And that is, in a lot of ways, up to cultural expression differences. And that it's not that these are unimportant. It's simply that we can't let the core of the gospel proclamation be sort of hijacked by our cultural differences. Instead, we need to let the gospel be the gospel. And likewise, our sort of expressional differences of how that gospel works itself out, let that sort of work itself out. And maybe if we're kind of, even if we're sharply opposed, we can perhaps say like Abraham and Lot in the Old Testament, let the Lord be judge between you and me. And in that sort of way, I think that gives us a more healthy perspective on what to expect whenever we are having interdenominational or interreligious dialogue. Because as the author comes back to, the main question we're asking is not one of what is evangelical or what is Catholic. The question is, what is God up to? How is God already using what has always been here, where Christ is always working here, and God has already shown up before we've shown up? And how are we now, in a way, how are we simply catching along or catching up with God on what God is already doing in those particular communities?